Tonight we begin deep beneath the Mojave Desert, inside one of the most infamous Vault-Tec experiments ever designed, Vault 11. On the surface, the vault appeared ordinary: reinforced steel corridors, clean residential wings, hydroponic gardens, and the promise of safety from the nuclear fire above. Like every vault, it was marketed as salvation. Families entered believing they were escaping the end of the world. But behind sealed doors and reassuring announcements, Vault 11 was never meant to protect its residents. It was built to study them. The experiment's premise was deceptively simple. Soon after the vault sealed, the population was informed by their central computer that each year they would need to elect one resident to be sacrificed. The chosen individual would be sent into a chamber and executed. If they refused, the computer warned, the entire vault would be destroyed. It was presented not as a choice, but as a grim duty necessary for survival. At first, the residents resisted the idea. Early terminal logs suggest disbelief and outrage. People argued that there must be another way, that the system was malfunctioning, that no sane authority could demand such cruelty. But the computer's warnings were explicit, and fear quickly reshaped morality. When survival feels conditional, ethics become negotiable. The first sacrifice set the tone for everything that followed. No one wanted to volunteer, so political alliances began forming almost immediately. Charismatic residents campaigned for influence, promising fairness while quietly maneuvering to protect themselves and their allies. Elections turned from civic exercises into life and death calculations. Voting blocks formed, rumors spread, accusations became commonplace. Over time, Vault 11's society transformed into something unrecognizable. Instead of cooperation, distrust dominated. The annual sacrifice became the center of life. Every decision, every friendship, every argument eventually circled back to one question: who would be chosen next? The process corrupted the political system entirely. Candidates for overseer began promising protection in exchange for loyalty. Some residents traded favors for votes. Others weaponized secrets, blackmailing rivals to avoid selection. The threat of sacrifice turned democracy into theater, with fear pulling the strings behind every result. As the years passed, the emotional toll deepened. Families lost loved ones, not to radiation or starvation, but to deliberate community decisions. Children grew up knowing that adulthood meant participating in executions. The ritual normalized itself, becoming a grim tradition accepted as necessary. And this normalization is what makes Vault 11 so disturbing. The residents were not violent by nature. They were ordinary people placed into an impossible scenario. Vault-Tec's experiment asked a horrifying question: would humans sacrifice one another if convinced it was the only path to survival? The answer, tragically, was yes. Eventually, factions emerged within the vault. Some argued that the sacrifices should target criminals or socially disruptive individuals. Others believed random selection would be fairer. Still others sought power purely to protect themselves. Political campaigns became vicious. Speeches promised safety, while quietly implying that certain groups should be considered as sacrifices. One particularly chilling development involved the creation of scapegoats. Individuals accused of immoral behavior were more likely to be nominated, regardless of evidence. Fear required an outlet, and blame became convenient. The annual sacrifice chamber itself became symbolic. Residents avoided discussing it openly, yet it haunted every conversation. The knowledge that a friend or neighbor might soon walk into that room lingered constantly in the background of daily life. As years turned into decades, resistance to the system faded. Some residents no longer questioned whether the sacrifices were necessary. They focused only on surviving the next election. Moral fatigue set in, yet not everyone accepted the system. Terminal logs suggest small groups formed in secret, questioning the computer's legitimacy. These dissidents argued that the threat might be a lie. They urged others to refuse participation. But fear held the majority in place. The risk of vault-wide death was too great. The eventual collapse of Vault 11 came not from outside invasion or system failure, but from human exhaustion. Political manipulation reached a breaking point when an attempted coup resulted in widespread killings. The community fractured beyond repair. A handful of survivors finally made a collective decision. They would refuse the sacrifice. Expecting immediate destruction, they entered the chamber together, prepared to die for their defiance. And then something astonishing happened. The computer congratulated them. The threat had always been fake. Vault 11's true experiment was to see whether people would willingly kill one another under the belief that sacrifice was required. Had the residents refused from the beginning, no one would have died. The vault would have continued functioning normally. Instead, years of executions had been self-inflicted. The surviving residents, realizing the truth, were devastated. They had murdered friends, spouses, and neighbors for nothing. The realization shattered what remained of their community. Most chose to leave the vault, unable to continue living among the reminders of their actions. Their ultimate fate is uncertain, but the vault itself stands as a monument to manipulation. Vault 11's story resonates deeply within the Fallout universe because it reflects how easily fear can override morality. The experiment did not rely on radiation or mutated creatures. It relied on psychology. Vault Tech understood that survival instincts could be weaponized. Unlike vaults that failed through technological disasters, Vault 11 functioned exactly as designed. The systems worked. Food and water remained stable. The only threat came from the narrative imposed on its residents. This distinction makes Vault 11 one of the most tragic vaults. The residents were not doomed by external forces. They were manipulated into becoming instruments of their own destruction. When explorers wander through Vault 11 centuries later, they find abandoned campaign posters, audio logs filled with desperation, and the silent sacrifice chamber still waiting. The emptiness feels heavy, as though the walls themselves remember what happened. The vault's lesson is subtle but powerful. Fear, when combined with authority, can transform ordinary people into participants in cruelty. The residents believed they were saving everyone each year, never realizing they were perpetuating the experiment. In a broader sense, Vault 11 reflects a recurring theme throughout Fallout. Systems, designed by distant powers, often place impossible choices on individuals. The people inside the vault were never given the information needed to make ethical decisions. They were placed inside a rigged moral puzzle and watched from afar. As we drift out of Vault 11's dim corridors and back toward the quiet hum of the Mojave wasteland above, the story lingers not because of monsters or battles, but because of its uncomfortable realism. No mutated horrors were required, only fear, isolation, and the belief that survival demanded sacrifice. And so Vault 11 remains one of the most haunting experiments ever conducted, a place where the greatest danger was not the world outside, but the quiet voice of authority convincing people to do the unthinkable. year after year, until almost no one was left to remember that they once had a choice. Toward the ruins of Bakersfield, California, where one of the earliest Vault-Tec experiments quietly reshaped an entire region of the wasteland. Vault 12 does not stand out at first glance. Its purpose seemed simple: a standard protective shelter meant to safeguard civilians from nuclear devastation. Families entered, expecting safety, stability, and a chance to outlast the radioactive storms raging above. But Vault 12 carried a hidden flaw built directly into its design. Unlike most vaults, its massive entrance door was intentionally engineered not to seal properly. At first, residents may not have understood the danger. The doors closed, the lights stayed on, systems functioned, but small cracks allowed radiation to seep inside over time. It was slow, almost imperceptible. No alarms screamed, no catastrophic failure occurred. Instead, the experiment relied on gradual exposure, a prolonged study of how humans would adapt when safety was quietly compromised. Vault-Tec wanted data on long-term radiation effects. The residents of Vault 12 were never told. In the early days, life likely resembled any other vault. People organized routines. Children attended makeshift classes. Adults maintained equipment and ration systems. The illusion of security remained intact, but eventually, symptoms began to appear: skin irritation, fatigue, persistent illness that medicine could not fully explain. Radiation poisoning is not dramatic at first. It lingers. As months turned into years, the effects deepened: hair loss, tissue damage, weakened immune systems. Some residents likely hoped it was temporary, a mechanical issue that could be fixed. Others suspected the truth, but had no way to escape. Unlike Vault 11, where fear drove deliberate violence, Vault 12's suffering came from environmental inevitability. The residents were trapped in a slow-motion disaster. And then, something unexpected happened. Instead of dying outright, many inhabitants began to mutate into ghouls. In Fallout's universe, ghoulification is a rare and poorly understood phenomenon. Extreme radiation exposure typically kills humans, but in certain cases it transforms them. Skin deteriorates. Hair falls out completely. Voices become rough and cracked. Yet intelligence and memory can remain intact. Vault 12 became one of the largest concentrations of ghouls in early post-war America. The process was not painless. Records suggest fear and confusion as residents realized they were changing physically. Mirrors became sources of horror. Friends stopped recognizing each other. The transformation blurred the line between survival and loss. Some residents likely believed they were becoming monsters. But unlike feral ghouls, many retained their minds. They adapted to their altered state, learning that radiation no longer harmed them. In fact, it sustained them. The very force that destroyed their lives also ensured their survival. When the vault eventually opened, its inhabitants emerged into a world already transformed by nuclear war. They founded a settlement among the ruins of Bakersfield, which became known as Necropolis. Necropolis stands as one of Fallout's earliest examples of post-war adaptation. The ghouls of Vault 12 built a community based on shared experience. They scavenged technology, repaired infrastructure, and attempted to carve out stability despite widespread prejudice from human survivors. This prejudice became one of their greatest challenges. Many wastelanders viewed ghouls with suspicion or outright hatred. Their appearance triggered fear. Rumors spread that they were dangerous or infected. Necropolis residents often faced hostility simply for existing. The irony is striking. Vault-Tech's experiment not only altered the residents biologically, but also doomed them socially. Inside the vault, they had been victims of corporate experimentation. Outside, they became outsiders in a world that feared what they represented. Necropolis struggled with water shortages and failing infrastructure. Over time, conflicts with other factions and environmental hardships eroded the settlement's stability. Yet, its existence demonstrated resilience. The ghouls survived despite circumstances designed to destroy them. Vault 12's experiment reveals a different aspect of Vault-Tech's philosophy. Unlike Vault 11's psychological manipulation, Vault 12 focused on biological adaptation. The experiment asked whether humans could endure radiation exposure over extended periods. The answer was complicated. They survived, but at a cost. The transformation into ghouls raises philosophical questions about identity. Are the residents still human? Their memories remained, their personalities endured, but society treated them differently. This tension echoes throughout the Fallout series, where ghouls often struggle against discrimination. Vault 12 became symbolic of that struggle. The vault itself eventually fell into ruin, overtaken by time and neglect. Its corridors, once filled with anxious families, became silent reminders of gradual suffering. The faulty door, the core of the experiment, stands as a monument to deliberate design. No heroic rebellion ended Vault 12's story. No dramatic confrontation exposed Vault-Tech's plans in time to save its residents. The experiment simply ran its course. This quiet tragedy is what makes Vault 12 so haunting. The residents likely never learned the truth. They may have believed the door failure was an accident, never realizing it had been intentional from the beginning. Vault-Tech observed silently while people adapted, suffered, and transformed. When players encounter Necropolis in the original Fallout, they witness the long-term consequences of that experiment. The ghouls are weary but determined. They protect their water supply fiercely, knowing survival remains fragile. Their existence challenges assumptions about mutation and humanity. They are proof that adaptation can occur even under cruel circumstances. Yet the scars of Vault 12 remain visible, both physical and emotional. As we drift through the quiet streets of Necropolis, the story feels less like horror and more like melancholy. These are not villains or monsters. They are survivors, shaped by a design flaw that was never accidental. Vault 12 stands apart from other experiments because its outcome did not collapse into chaos or violence. It evolved into a new kind of life, and that life carried the burden of being misunderstood. The Vault's legacy extends beyond its walls. It contributed to the broader wasteland's perception of radiation and mutation. It showed that survival sometimes means becoming something unfamiliar. As the wind moves through the cracked buildings of Bakersfield and the glow of distant radiation flickers against ruined concrete, Vault 12 reminds us that not all experiments end with explosions or madness. Some end quietly, with communities learning to live with consequences they never chose. And in the end, the door that never fully closed did more than let radiation inside. It opened the path to an entirely new identity, leaving behind a legacy of endurance shaped by suffering, adaptation, and the uneasy question of what it truly means to survive when the world changes you forever. One of the most important vaults in the entire Fallout universe, Vault 13. Unlike many vaults built for twisted social experiments or cruel manipulation, Vault 13 was originally intended to be something different. It was one of the few designated control vaults designed to operate as advertised. Its residents were supposed to live in long-term isolation, safe from the wasteland, preserving humanity until the right time to emerge. At least, that was the plan. Vault 13 rested deep beneath the mountains of California, sealed away from the chaos that followed the Great War. Its residents entered, believing they would remain underground for decades, possibly generations. Their overseer reinforced discipline and stability, emphasizing conservation of resources and strict adherence to rules. The early years of Vault 13 were quiet compared to the chaos experienced by other vaults. Life followed predictable routines. Food was rationed carefully. Education focused on maintenance, science, and history. People formed families within the metal corridors, accepting that the outside world was likely uninhabitable. This isolation shaped the culture of Vault 13. Residents grew cautious, methodical, and deeply reliant on systems. Every function, water recycling, air purification, food production, depended on maintenance. Failure was not an option. Unlike Vault 11, where fear was weaponized, or Vault 12, where radiation seeped in slowly, Vault 13's danger would come from something far simpler: a malfunctioning water chip. The water purification system, vital to the vault's survival, began to fail decades after sealing. At first, it was manageable, but replacement parts were unavailable. Without a working chip, the vault faced eventual dehydration and collapse. For the first time, Vault 13's isolation became a liability. The overseer made a decision that would ripple across the entire wasteland. One resident would leave the vault and search for a replacement water chip. This individual became known as the Vault Dweller, the protagonist of the original Fallout. The departure marked a profound shift in Vault 13's identity. For generations, residents believed the outside world was deadly and distant. Sending someone out shattered that certainty. It acknowledged that survival now depended on engagement with the wasteland. The Vault Dweller's journey exposed a larger world full of settlements, mutants, raiders, and emerging factions. Meanwhile, back inside Vault 13, life continued in uneasy anticipation. The residents waited. They expected the Vault Dweller to return with salvation, but the journey changed everything. The Vault Dweller eventually succeeded, bringing back a replacement chip and ensuring the Vault's immediate survival. Yet their experiences in the wasteland revealed threats far greater than mechanical failure, most notably the rise of the Master and the Unity. After preventing this existential threat, the Vault Dweller returned home expecting welcome and relief. Instead, they were exiled. The Overseer feared that exposure to the outside world had changed the Vault Dweller too much. Allowing them to remain might inspire others to leave, destabilizing the Vault's carefully maintained isolation. The decision was pragmatic, but devastating. This moment defines Vault 13's tragedy. A vault designed to preserve humanity rejected its own savior to preserve stability. The exile created a schism within the community. Some residents began questioning the Overseer's authority. Others wondered whether isolation was truly sustainable. Over time, more individuals left the vault, inspired by stories of the outside world. Vault 13's identity shifted from closed system to reluctant participant in post-war society. This shift attracted unwanted attention. The Enclave, remnants of the pre-war U.S. government obsessed with genetic purity, eventually discovered Vault 13. Seeing its population as valuable, pure humans untouched by widespread radiation, the Enclave kidnapped many residents for experimentation. The vault that had spent generations protecting its population from the outside world fell not to internal failure, but to external exploitation. The survivors scattered. Some integrated into nearby communities, others disappeared into history. The once stable control vault became another casualty of the wasteland's relentless pressures. Vault 13's story stands out because it demonstrates that even a vault without malicious experimentation was not immune to tragedy. The control design itself was an experiment of sorts, testing whether isolation could preserve society intact. In many ways, it succeeded for a time. Residents maintained order, avoided internal collapse, and survived longer than most vault populations. But the water chip failure revealed an uncomfortable truth. No system can remain completely closed forever. Dependence on technology created vulnerability. When a single component failed, the entire structure of isolation crumbled. Vault 13 also introduced one of Fallout's central themes, the tension between safety and freedom. The Overseer's decisions were rooted in survival logic, yet they often conflicted with individual autonomy. Exiling the Vault Dweller preserved order temporarily, but fractured trust. From a narrative perspective, Vault 13 serves as the origin point for much of Fallout's history. The Vault Dweller's actions influenced the rise and fall of factions across California. Communities like Shady Sands and later the New California Republic emerged partly because of the connections made during that journey. In this way, Vault 13 unintentionally shaped the future it sought to avoid. Its residents wanted isolation, but their survival required engagement with the world. Exploring Vault 13 later in Fallout 2 reveals a place changed by time. Systems still function, but the sense of permanence is gone. The vault feels quieter, almost hesitant, as though aware that its original purpose has ended. The Enclave's abduction of residents adds a layer of bitterness. After generations of careful preservation, the vault's population became targets precisely because they had remained isolated. Protection became vulnerability. Vault 13's story is less about horror and more about inevitability. The residents were not manipulated into cruelty. They were not subjected to bizarre experiments. Their downfall came from ordinary fragility, mechanical failure, leadership choices, and external forces beyond their control. Yet this quiet realism makes the story powerful. In the Fallout universe, where extreme experiments dominate many Vault narratives, Vault 13 reminds us that even the successful systems carry hidden costs. Isolation preserves culture, but stifles adaptation. Stability prevents chaos, but can resist necessary change. The Vault Dweller's exile symbolizes that tension perfectly. The person most responsible for saving the vault could no longer fit within it. As we drift through Vault 13's softly humming corridors, past living quarters that once felt permanent, the story feels almost peaceful compared to other vault tragedies. But beneath that calm lies a subtle sadness, a reminder that survival often demands compromise. The vault that began as humanity's safe haven ultimately became a stepping stone into a wider, uncertain world. And in that transition, Vault 13 revealed a truth that echoes throughout the Fallout series. No matter how strong the walls or how careful the planning, eventually the outside world finds its way in, and the people inside must decide whether to cling to the past or step into the unknown. Vault 15 began with an ambitious premise and ended up shaping the political landscape of the entire wasteland. Unlike many Vault tech experiments built around obvious cruelty or bizarre scientific variables, Vault 15's setup seemed almost reasonable on paper. It was populated by people from radically different ethnic, religious, and ideological backgrounds, placed together to see whether diversity under extreme confinement would create harmony or conflict. Vault Tech's hidden twist, however, ensured that tension would grow. The vault's opening date was intentionally delayed far beyond the residents' expectations. Isolation would last not years, but generations. Differences that might have softened over time were instead compressed within a sealed environment, with no option to leave. At first, life inside Vault 15 likely resembled cautious optimism. Residents had survived the Great War. They had shelter, food, and a functioning community. Families built routines. Cultural traditions continued in small ways. Celebrations, religious practices, and shared stories preserving identity in the underground world. But confinement has a way of magnifying differences. Without external challenges to unite against, internal distinctions became more pronounced. Political debates turned personal. Ideological disagreements lingered longer than they might have on the surface. What began as diversity gradually evolved into factionalism. Terminal records and later lore suggest that social groups formed around shared beliefs and values. Some advocated strict control and resource management. Others pushed for openness and adaptation. Religious differences sometimes clashed with pragmatic survival decisions. Vault-Tech's experiment centered on a simple question: could a highly diverse population coexist peacefully when forced into long-term isolation? The answer was complicated. As years passed, trust eroded. Arguments escalated into rivalries. The delayed opening amplified frustration as residents realized they were trapped far longer than expected. Leadership struggled to mediate growing divisions. Unlike Vault 11, where fear of sacrifice drove violence, Vault 15's conflict grew organically from social tension. No artificial threat was needed. Human differences alone provided the pressure. Eventually, schisms became irreversible. Groups within the vault began planning for different futures. Some wanted to leave as soon as possible. Others believed the vault should remain sealed. Compromise became increasingly difficult. When Vault 15 finally opened, the population did not emerge as a unified community. Instead, it fragmented. Several groups departed in different directions, each carrying their own philosophies and grievances. These departing factions would shape the wasteland in profound ways. One group settled and eventually founded Shady Sands, which later evolved into the New California Republic, one of the largest attempts at rebuilding structured civilization in Fallout lore. This community emphasized cooperation, governance, and long-term stability. Other groups took darker paths. The Khans, Jackals, and Vipers, future raider factions known for violence and raids, also traced their origins to Vault 15. Their divergence illustrates how different responses to the same environment can produce radically different outcomes. The Vault's experiment therefore succeeded in an unexpected way. It did not create a single social result. Instead, it generated multiple futures. Vault 15 demonstrates that diversity itself is not inherently destabilizing. Rather, isolation and resource stress transformed differences into conflict. Once residents had the freedom to leave, their paths reflected their values and experiences. The Vault's physical condition reinforces this story. When explorers encounter Vault 15 later, much of it lies in disrepair. Signs of conflict remain scattered throughout the corridors. Broken equipment and damaged sections suggest a turbulent final period before abandonment. Yet, unlike many Vault tragedies, Vault 15 was not annihilated. its residents survived. Their legacy lived on above ground. This outcome makes Vault 15 unique. Rather than ending in total collapse, it acted as a catalyst for new societies, both peaceful and violent. The emergence of Shady Sands from Vault 15's survivors highlights the possibility of positive adaptation. Despite internal conflict, some residents carried forward lessons of cooperation and governance. They built farms, established leadership structures, and gradually expanded influence. Meanwhile, the Khans and other raider descendants reflected a different response, embracing strength, mobility, and survival through aggression. The divergence raises interesting questions about human nature. Were these outcomes predetermined by ideology before entering the vault? Or did the vault environment push people toward extremes? Vault-Tec likely hoped to observe exactly this kind of social evolution. Unlike Vault 12's biological experiment or Vault 11's moral manipulation, Vault 15 tested whether diversity under pressure would fracture or adapt. The answer seems to be both. The delayed opening date played a critical role. Had residents emerged earlier, tensions might not have escalated as severely. Instead, generations grew up knowing only confinement and rivalry, shaping identities around opposition. This mirrors real-world social dynamics, where isolation can intensify group boundaries. Vault 15's influence on Fallout's broader narrative cannot be overstated. The NCR, perhaps the most ambitious attempt at restoring pre-war governance, owes its origins to this experiment. At the same time, notorious raider factions also stem from the same source. One vault produced both civilization and chaos. This dual legacy makes Vault 15 particularly fascinating for sleep storytelling. It is not simply a tale of failure or success. It is a story of branching paths. When the vault door finally opened, residents faced the same wasteland but made vastly different choices. Some sought cooperation. Others embraced conflict. The vault itself gradually faded into history, overshadowed by the societies it spawned. Yet its corridors remain a reminder that social experiments do not always have singular conclusions. Vault 15 suggests that humanity's strength and weakness lie in diversity itself, the ability to adapt differently based on belief, experience, and leadership. As we drift through the quiet remnants of Vault 15, imagining families once debating their futures under fluorescent lights, the atmosphere feels less ominous than reflective. This was not a vault of monsters or madness. It was a vault of people trying to coexist under impossible conditions. And when coexistence failed, they carried their differences into the world above, shaping the wasteland in ways Vault-Tec could never fully predict. In the end, Vault 15 stands as a reminder that experiments involving human societies rarely produce clear outcomes. Instead, they create stories, some hopeful, some tragic, that continue long after the doors open. And beneath the dust of California, where abandoned hallways echo with the memory of arguments and hopes intertwined, Vault 15 quietly reminds us that even in controlled environments, humanity's future cannot be engineered into a single path. It will always split, grow, and reshape itself in unexpected ways, leaving behind legacies far larger than the vault that first contained them. One of the more mysterious vaults in Fallout lore, Vault 17. Unlike vaults with detailed terminal logs and clearly documented experiments, Vault 17 exists largely in fragments and implications. Its story is pieced together from scattered dialogue, lore references, and the grim fate of its inhabitants. That uncertainty makes it especially unsettling, because sometimes what is missing tells us as much as what is known. Vault 17 was located somewhere on the West Coast. Official records describing its intended experiment are absent or heavily obscured. Whether this secrecy was intentional or simply lost to time remains unknown. What we do know is that the vault survived long enough for a community to establish itself underground, isolated from the outside world like so many others. For years, perhaps decades, the residents likely lived ordinary vault lives. Routine maintenance, ration management, education, and the careful balancing of resources defined their existence. They were one small pocket of humanity, waiting out a ruined world. Then something changed. Vault 17 did not collapse from internal conflict or technological failure. Instead, it encountered one of the most transformative forces in early Fallout history, the Unity, led by the Master. The Unity's goal was radical. Through exposure to the forced evolutionary virus, the Master sought to transform humanity into a new species, supermutants, immune to radiation, disease, and perceived human weakness. To achieve this, his followers needed subjects. Vault populations were ideal targets. When the Unity discovered Vault 17, its residents became victims of forced evolution. The vault was raided, its inhabitants captured and transported to facilities such as Mariposa Military Base, where they were exposed to FEV and transformed into supermutants against their will. This is the central tragedy of Vault 17. Its people did not fail themselves. They were taken, unlike Vault 11 or Vault 15, where internal dynamics shaped outcomes. Vault 17's fate was determined by external intervention. Its residents had prepared for life underground, but they were not prepared for an invading ideology determined to remake humanity entirely. The process of transformation into supermutants was violent and irreversible. Some individuals died during exposure. Others emerged physically stronger, but altered mentally. Memory loss was common, personal identity blurred. For the residents of Vault 17, this meant the end of their community, not through death alone, but through erasure of who they had been. One of the most notable supermutants connected to Vault 17 is Lily Bowen, encountered in Fallout New Vegas. Through dialogue, Lily reveals fragments of memory from her life before mutation. She recalls being a grandmother, caring for children, and living in a vault before being taken by the Master's forces. Her story provides a rare emotional window into Vault 17's fate. Through Lily, the abstract concept of captured residents becomes personal. These were families, elders, and children, individuals with histories and relationships transformed into something unrecognizable. The psychological impact of this forced evolution cannot be overstated. Supermutants created by the Unity often struggled with identity. Some embraced their new existence, believing the Master's promise of unity and strength. Others retained fragments of humanity and mourned what was lost. Vault 17 represents one of the largest known examples of this transformation happening to an entire vault population. Because records are scarce, the vault itself feels ghost-like within Fallout's history. Players never fully explore it. Instead, it exists as an absence, a community referenced but never seen. This absence amplifies the mystery. What was life like before the raid? Did residents know anything about the outside world? Did they attempt resistance? How many survived the transformation? We do not know, and that uncertainty creates a haunting atmosphere around Vault 17. The Unity's raid also highlights a recurring theme in Fallout. Isolation does not guarantee safety. Vault residents often believed sealed doors would protect them indefinitely. Vault 17 proves otherwise. The wasteland's dangers eventually find even the most hidden communities. From a broader perspective, Vault 17 demonstrates how the Master's vision reshaped the West Coast. Super mutants were not born monsters. Many were once ordinary people, pulled from vaults and settlements. This complicates moral interpretations within the series. The super mutants encountered later in Fallout titles carry histories erased by transformation. They are products of coercion rather than choice. Vault 17's residents became symbols of that loss. The Vault's unknown experiment adds another layer of intrigue. Some fans speculate that its purpose may have involved social observation or long-term isolation, similar to control vaults. Others suggest records were intentionally erased after the Unity's raid. Regardless of intention, Vault 17's outcome became defined by forces far beyond Vault-Tech's design. The contrast between Vault-Tech's experiments and the Master's forced evolution is striking. Vault-Tech manipulated environments to observe behavior. The Master sought direct transformation, imposing his ideology physically. For the residents of Vault 17, both systems removed agency. Their lives were shaped first by corporate experimentation and later by ideological conquest. Lily Bowen's character reminds us that humanity can persist even after extreme change. Her memories flicker unpredictably, sometimes surfacing through confusion and longing. She remembers grandchildren she can no longer protect, a life she can never return to. Through her, Vault 17's story becomes less about mystery and more about grief. The Vault did not leave behind broken machinery or haunting audio logs. Instead, its legacy walks the wasteland in mutated bodies carrying fragmented memories. This is perhaps why Vault 17 feels uniquely unsettling among Fallout vaults. Most vault stories end within their walls. Vault 17's story continues outside, scattered among super mutants who may not even remember where they came from. As we imagine the quiet corridors of Vault 17 before the raid, families eating together, children learning, routines unfolding peacefully, the contrast with their eventual fate feels especially tragic. Safety turned into captivity, survival turned into transformation. The Vault's disappearance from detailed records mirrors the fate of its residents. Both were absorbed into something larger, losing individual identity along the way. In the end, Vault 17 stands as a reminder that not all experiments conclude neatly. Some are interrupted by history itself. Some vanish, leaving only echoes in the memories of those changed forever. And somewhere in the unseen halls of Vault 17, long, silent, and forgotten, the story lingers as a quiet question whispered through the wasteland. How many communities disappeared without trace? Their people transformed into legends and monsters. Their true names buried beneath the weight of forced evolution and time. Beneath the Mojave Desert is a vault designed not to test survival, but to study division itself. Vault 19 appears. At first glance, like many others, reinforced steel corridors, communal living spaces, maintenance wings humming quietly in the background. Yet almost immediately, something feels unusual about it. Everything is split. Residents were divided into two groups from the beginning, red and blue. Separate living quarters, separate leadership structures, separate daily routines. The division was not based on ideology, talent, or personal choice. It was arbitrary. That arbitrariness was the experiment. Vault-Tech wanted to see what would happen when people were separated into competing groups without meaningful reason, then subtly encouraged to distrust each other. Vault 19 was less about survival and more about psychological manipulation, an experiment in factionalism. In the early days, the separation likely felt harmless. Red and blue teams may have treated the arrangement as a simple organizational tool. Friendly rivalries could have emerged. Competitions over efficiency or productivity might even have added excitement to daily life, but the vault systems ensured that rivalry would not remain friendly. Through subliminal messaging embedded in environmental cues, maintenance announcements, and even background sounds, residents were exposed to constant suggestions that the other group could not be trusted. Small equipment failures were quietly attributed to sabotage. Supply discrepancies were left unexplained. Minor inconveniences became seeds of suspicion. No direct accusations were needed. Human minds filled the gaps on their own. Over time, harmless differences hardened into identity. People stopped seeing themselves as simply residents of Vault 19. They became members of Red or Blue. Loyalty shifted from community to faction. This transformation is central to the Vault's horror. Division was manufactured, not natural, yet once established, it felt authentic. Daily routines began to reflect the split. Conversations were limited to within each group. Leadership structures developed independently, creating separate narratives about what was happening in the vault. If a machine failed in one wing, the other group was quietly blamed. The psychological pressure intensified gradually. Residents grew wary of crossing boundaries. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some believed the opposing group planned a takeover. Others suspected hidden agendas from leadership. The experiment relied on paranoia feeding itself. Unlike Vault 11's explicit threat of sacrifice, Vault 19's manipulation was subtle. Residents were never told they were enemies. They simply began to believe it. As the years passed, the effects became visible. Terminal logs describe increasing anxiety and distrust. Sleep disturbances and emotional instability were common. Some residents developed symptoms resembling psychosis, unable to distinguish rumor from reality. The vault's environment reinforced tension constantly. Color-coded sections reminded inhabitants of their assigned identity at every turn. Even architecture encouraged separation. What began as organizational convenience became psychological prison. Eventually, conflict escalated. Arguments turned into confrontations. The sense of shared purpose eroded entirely. Residents interpreted ordinary accidents as deliberate attacks. The genius and cruelty of Vaultec's design lies in how little direct intervention was required. Once mistrust took root, the community destabilized itself. The final fate of Vault 19's original population remains unclear. By the time players encounter the vault in Fallout New Vegas, it is largely abandoned by its initial inhabitants. Signs of conflict remain scattered throughout: damaged equipment, personal logs filled with fear, and evidence of hurried departures. The vault later became occupied by powder gangers, a faction of escaped convicts seeking shelter. Their presence adds another layer of irony. A vault designed to study division and mistrust eventually housed individuals already shaped by societal breakdown. Vault 19's story resonates because it reflects a universal truth. Division does not require deep ideological differences. It can be created artificially through repeated suggestion and environmental design. The red versus blue distinction mirrors countless real-world examples of group identity forming around arbitrary differences. Once identity becomes tied to group loyalty, cooperation becomes difficult. From a narrative perspective, Vault 19 functions almost like a psychological mirror. It asks how quickly humans categorize themselves and others, and how easily those categories can be weaponized. The residents were not violent people entering the vault. They were ordinary individuals placed in a system designed to amplify suspicion. The use of subliminal messaging adds another layer of discomfort. Residents were influenced without awareness, their perceptions shaped subtly by external systems. This loss of agency makes the experiment especially disturbing. Unlike direct manipulation, subliminal influence leaves victims unsure whether their fears are real or imagined. In Fallout, New Vegas, the lingering atmosphere of Vault 19 reflects this confusion. The vault feels tense, even in abandonment. Logs hint at residents questioning their own thoughts, unsure whether they could trust themselves. The psychological toll likely drove many to leave. Some may have attempted reconciliation, others likely carried their paranoia with them into the wasteland. The experiment's outcome suggests that once trust collapses, rebuilding it is extraordinarily difficult. Vault 19 stands in contrast to Vault 15, where diversity led to branching societies. Here, artificial division produced fragmentation without clear ideological foundation. No grand philosophy justified the conflict, only colors. This simplicity makes the vault's outcome unsettlingly realistic. People did not need major differences to turn against one another. They only needed consistent suggestion that differences mattered. The Powder Gangers' later occupation symbolizes how conflict leaves spaces vulnerable. A community fractured by mistrust could not maintain control, allowing outsiders to claim the ruins. As we move through Vault 19's quiet corridors, it's easy to imagine the echoes of arguments once filling the halls, whispered accusations, nervous glances, strained alliances. The vault's experiment succeeded, not because it created violence directly, but because it proved how easily unity can be dismantled. In the broader context of Fallout, Vault 19 reinforces the idea that the greatest dangers are often psychological rather than physical. Radiation and scarcity threaten survival, but mistrust threatens society itself. And so, Vault 19 remains a haunting lesson buried beneath the Mojave, a place where people were separated by colors they didn't choose, nudged toward suspicion they didn't understand, until the idea of community dissolved entirely, leaving behind a silent reminder that division, once introduced, can grow faster than anyone expects, quietly transforming neighbors into strangers, until there is no one left to remember that they were ever one community at all. One of the strangest social experiments ever attempted by Vault-Tec, Vault 21, located beneath what would eventually become the New Vegas Strip. At first glance, Vault 21 feels almost lighthearted compared to the grim stories of sacrifice chambers or radiation exposure. Its residents were not forced into brutal competitions or subjected to secret toxins. Instead, they were given a single rule meant to govern every aspect of life. All disputes had to be settled through games of chance. Whether the disagreement involved resources, leadership decisions, or personal arguments, the answer was always the same: gamble for it. This principle formed the foundation of the vault's culture. Cards, roulette wheels, dice, and other games were integrated into daily life. Chance replaced authority. Instead of fights or political maneuvering, residents turned to luck to resolve conflicts. At first, the system may have felt liberating. Without violence or rigid hierarchies, disputes could end quickly. Winners and losers accepted outcomes because the process felt impartial. No one could claim favoritism when chance decided. The idea aligned perfectly with the culture that would later define New Vegas itself, a city built on gambling, risk, and spectacle. But in Vault 21, the experiment was not about entertainment. It was about social stability. Vault-Tec wanted to know whether randomness could replace traditional governance. Early life in the vault appeared surprisingly stable. Residents embraced gambling as both pastime and civic process. Friendly competitions became common. Skills in games were admired. Even routine decisions could be decided by a roll of the dice. The absence of violence is particularly striking in the vault's history. Unlike many other experiments, Vault 21 did not descend rapidly into chaos. The rules were clear, and participants believed in them. However, chance is never truly neutral. Over time, patterns emerged. Individuals with greater skill, psychological insight, or patience tended to win more often. Though outcomes were technically random, expertise influenced probability. This created informal status structures, where skilled gamblers gained reputation and influence. Luck began to resemble power. Even so, the vault maintained relative harmony for decades. The shared belief in the fairness of games prevented resentment from escalating into violence. Disagreements ended at the table rather than in conflict. This stability makes Vault 21 unique among vault experiments. It demonstrated that structured systems of chance could reduce direct confrontation, yet subtle tensions remained beneath the surface. Reliance on gambling meant uncertainty became part of daily life. Decisions affecting families or livelihoods could hinge on a single hand of cards. Some residents likely felt anxious about outcomes beyond their control. Others embraced the thrill. The psychological effect of living under constant randomness shaped the vault's culture profoundly. Risk-taking became normalized. Confidence and charm were valuable social skills. Unlike Vault 19's engineered mistrust, Vault 21 encouraged acceptance of unpredictability. The experiment might have continued indefinitely, if not for forces outside the vault. When the post-war world began to stabilize in the Mojave, a powerful figure emerged with a vision for rebuilding Las Vegas: Robert House. A pre-war industrialist who survived through advanced life support technology, House sought to transform the ruins above into a thriving city centered on controlled gambling and economic revival. Vault 21 stood directly in the path of that vision. House negotiated with the vault's residents, eventually winning ownership through a game of blackjack, an outcome perfectly aligned with the vault's own values. The residents accepted the result, consistent with their long-standing belief in chance as final authority. But House's plans required major changes. He converted Vault 21 into a hotel and tourist attraction, integrating it into the Strip's growing economy. Much of the vault was filled with concrete, sealing off lower levels permanently. Residents were displaced, relocated, or absorbed into the broader city. The transformation marked the end of the experiment. Unlike vaults destroyed by disaster or internal collapse, Vault 21 ended through peaceful absorption into a larger system. Its culture of gambling did not vanish entirely. Instead, it expanded outward, influencing New Vegas itself. This outcome raises interesting questions about the experiment's success. Did chance-based governance truly create stability, or did it merely delay inevitable change? The residents adapted surprisingly well to external takeover, perhaps because their worldview already accepted unpredictable outcomes. Luck, after all, had always decided their fate. Exploring Vault 21 later reveals preserved sections turned into museum-like spaces. Visitors can see remnants of living quarters, gaming areas, and memorabilia celebrating the vault's history. The atmosphere feels nostalgic rather than tragic. And yet, there is a quiet sadness beneath the surface. The community that once resolved every conflict through games dissolved not through failure, but through irrelevance. External power reshaped their world faster than their system could adapt. Vault 21's experiment demonstrates both the strengths and limitations of chance as a social tool. Random outcomes can reduce personal blame, but they cannot shield a society from larger forces. In contrast to Vault 11's moral collapse or Vault 12's biological mutation, Vault 21 represents a rare example of relative success. Its residents avoided large-scale violence and maintained cohesion for decades. Still, the experiment reveals subtle complexities. Chance may feel fair, but repeated losses can erode confidence. Skilled players inevitably gain influence, creating informal hierarchies despite the appearance of equality. Over time, luck alone cannot resolve deeper structural challenges. The conversion of the vault into a hotel symbolizes a broader theme in Fallout. Systems built for survival eventually give way to systems built for commerce and power. The residents of Vault 21 entered believing games would decide everything. In the end, a game did decide their future, but on terms set by someone outside their community. As we drift through the brightly lit halls of New Vegas above and imagine the original vault buried beneath concrete, the story of Vault 21 feels almost like a quiet epilogue amid darker experiments. It is not a tale of horror, but of adaptation. Yet, there is still something unsettling about a society that entrusted its most important decisions to chance. The comfort of randomness hides the reality that outcomes can reshape lives irreversibly. And so Vault 21 remains a fascinating anomaly, a vault where luck replaced law, where disputes ended with shuffled cards instead of violence, and where a community built on games eventually became part of a city defined by risk itself, reminding us that sometimes the most unusual experiments are not those that collapse dramatically, but those that quietly blend into the world outside, leaving behind only echoes of dice, rolling in the dark, and the lingering question of whether chance was ever truly fair at all. One of the most unsettling vaults in the Mojave, Vault 22, a place where science meant to save humanity, slowly transformed into something alive, relentless, and impossible to control. Unlike experiments focused on politics or social behavior, Vault 22 was built around hope. Its purpose seemed practical, even noble, to develop genetically modified crops capable of surviving in post-war conditions and feeding future generations. If the wasteland lacked clean soil and reliable food, then perhaps science could overcome those limits. At least, that was the promise. Vault 22 functioned as a botanical research facility. Its interior was unlike most vaults, less metallic and sterile, more alive. Hydroponic bays, seed banks, and climate-controlled ecosystems filled large sections of the vault. Plants grew in carefully monitored environments, and researchers worked toward creating sustainable food sources resistant to radiation and harsh climates. In the early years, residents likely felt optimistic. The experiment gave purpose to daily life. Scientists conducted studies, technicians maintained systems, and families lived among lush greenery rather than concrete walls. Compared to other vaults, Vault 22 may have felt almost peaceful, but life inside the vault depended on constant balance. Researchers experimented with genetic modification, accelerating plant growth and resilience. They introduced experimental organisms designed to enhance production and resistance. Among these innovations was a fungal organism intended to improve crop health. That fungus would become the vault's downfall. At first, the changes seemed successful, plants grew faster and hardier. Food supplies increased. The ecosystem flourished in ways that exceeded expectations. Then the fungus began to spread beyond intended boundaries. Spores escaped containment and entered the air systems. Exposure initially caused mild symptoms: coughing, fatigue, irritation, nothing alarming enough to halt operations. Scientists treated it as a manageable complication, but the spores adapted. As infection spread, residents began showing behavioral and physical changes. The fungus integrated with human hosts, altering their biology. Skin texture changed. Speech became erratic. Aggression increased. The infected were not merely sick, they were transforming. The vault's lush environment, once a symbol of hope, became a perfect breeding ground for contamination. Isolation amplified the problem. With no external help and limited understanding of the organism's evolution, researchers struggled to contain outbreaks. Quarantines were attempted. Areas of the vault were sealed off. But the fungus continued to grow. One of the most disturbing aspects of Vault 22's story is how slowly the danger emerged. There was no singular catastrophe, no explosion or sudden invasion. Instead, the vault was consumed gradually, almost quietly. The infected residents eventually became what explorers later call spore carriers, humanoid beings controlled or heavily influenced by the fungal organism. They moved through the greenery silently, attacking intruders to protect the ecosystem that had claimed them. In a sense, the plants had won. The fungus blurred the line between organism and environment. It no longer simply infected individuals, it turned them into extensions of the vault itself. The once carefully cultivated gardens became dangerous, overgrown labyrinths filled with hostile life. Terminal entries reveal the growing panic among surviving researchers. Some advocated destroying the entire vault to prevent spores from escaping. Others believed a cure might still be possible. Disagreements delayed decisive action, allowing the infection to spread further. Eventually, organized resistance collapsed. Some residents attempted escape into the Mojave. Others disappeared into sealed sections of the vault. The ecosystem continued evolving long after human control ended. Centuries later, when the vault is explored, it feels less like a man-made shelter and more like a natural cave overtaken by vegetation. Thick vines cover walls. Spores drift through shafts of light. The air feels heavy, alive. The transformation of Vault 22 carries a profound irony. The experiment intended to solve hunger and sustain civilization. Instead, it produced a self-sustaining biological threat capable of consuming humans. The vault raises unsettling questions about scientific ambition. How far should experimentation go when ecosystems are involved? Can life be engineered without unforeseen consequences? Unlike Vault 11's moral dilemma or Vault 19's psychological manipulation, Vault 22's horror emerges from unintended success. The plants survived too well. This theme resonates deeply within Fallout's broader narrative, where attempts to control nature often backfire. Radiation reshapes organisms unpredictably. Genetic engineering produces new dangers. Vault 22 illustrates how optimism can become catastrophe when caution fades. The infected spore carriers are particularly tragic. They were once scientists, technicians, parents, ordinary people trying to ensure humanity's survival. Their transformation strips away individuality, turning them into guardians of an ecosystem that no longer needs human guidance. Some logs suggest survivors debated burning the vault entirely. Fire, unlike containment, offered certainty. Yet the decision was never fully executed, leaving the vault's dangers to persist. This lingering threat extends beyond the vault itself. Concerns arise that spores could spread to the surface, potentially creating wider ecological disasters. The Mojave's harsh environment may have limited this spread, but the possibility remains unsettling. Vault 22 stands apart visually and atmospherically from most vaults. Instead of sterile decay, it feels vibrant, beautiful even. Greenery fills every space. Water trickles through corridors. Nature reclaims technology. That beauty enhances the horror. The environment feels alive, yet hostile. In many ways, Vault 22 symbolizes humanity's fragile relationship with nature. The residents tried to shape life for their benefit, only to be absorbed by it instead. The story also reflects a recurring fallout idea. Progress without restraint leads to unintended consequences. The scientists were not malicious. They believed they were solving a problem, but good intentions did not prevent disaster. As we imagine walking through Vault 22's overgrown corridors, hearing distant rustling among leaves, the atmosphere feels almost dreamlike. The distinction between vault and forest disappears. Humanity's structures fade beneath organic growth, and there lies the vault's final message. Life continues, with or without human control. The gardens of Vault 22 did survive the apocalypse, just not in the way anyone expected. Where once residents cultivated plants to feed future generations, those same plants eventually consumed their caretakers, transforming the vault into a living monument to scientific ambition gone unchecked. And so Vault 22 remains one of the most haunting experiments of the wasteland, a place where hope grew into danger, where careful cultivation became unstoppable spread, and where the quiet rustle of leaves in dark corridors reminds us that nature does not always need humanity to survive, but humanity often forgets how easily it can lose control of the things it creates. Moving deeper into the Mojave wasteland, toward a vault whose experiment seems almost simple compared to others, yet its outcome is among the most tragic. Vault 34 was designed around abundance. While many vaults struggled with strict rationing or controlled scarcity, Vault 34 was deliberately equipped with an overstocked armory filled with weapons and ammunition far beyond what normal residents would ever need. Vault-Tec wanted to test a straightforward idea. What happens when a closed community has easy access to firepower? At first, the setup may not have seemed dangerous. Weapons were framed as protection. The world outside was hostile, after all, and residents likely felt reassured knowing they could defend themselves if necessary. Security personnel trained regularly. Residents understood that the armory existed as a safety measure, but abundance changes behavior. Unlike scarcity, which encourages cooperation and careful planning, surplus can foster complacency and competition. Over time, firearms became symbols of status and influence within the vault. Enthusiasts formed groups centered around training and defense. Arguments over access and policies began to surface. In the early years, these tensions remained manageable. Vault life carried on with routines, community events, and the steady hum of systems keeping everything stable. Families grew, children learned, and the armory remained a silent presence, powerful but contained. Yet the experiment's flaw was psychological rather than mechanical. When weapons are abundant, conflict carries higher stakes. Disagreements that might have ended in discussion began escalating. Security measures tightened. Some residents advocated stricter control of the arsenal, while others argued for open access as a fundamental right. These debates mirrored larger themes of trust and authority. Who should decide who gets to wield power? Can a community remain peaceful when everyone knows deadly force is readily available? Over time, factions formed around these questions. Political arguments turned personal. Accusations spread that certain groups were stockpiling weapons or preparing for control. The vault's overseer faced mounting pressure. Attempts to mediate often satisfied no one. The very presence of so many weapons ensured that every disagreement felt potentially dangerous. Then came the crisis. Accounts suggest that unrest eventually escalated into violence. Whether triggered by a specific event or gradual deterioration remains unclear, but armed conflict erupted within the vault. Firefights in enclosed corridors damaged essential infrastructure. Systems designed for stability were never meant to withstand internal warfare. The fighting caused catastrophic damage to the reactor and power systems. Radiation began leaking through the vault. Unlike Vault 12, where exposure was intentional and gradual, Vault 34's radiation disaster was accidental, a direct consequence of human conflict fueled by overabundant weaponry. As radiation levels rose, survival became increasingly difficult. Many residents attempted to flee. Some escaped into the Mojave and later founded or joined communities, such as the Boomers at Nellis Air Force Base, who retained a strong cultural connection to heavy weaponry and self-defense. Those who remained inside the vault faced a grim future. Radiation transformed the environment into a deadly hazard. Corridors filled with glowing water. Systems failed. Survivors succumbed to sickness or became feral ghouls over time. By the era of Fallout, New Vegas, Vault 34 is a dangerous ruin. Its once organized halls are flooded and irradiated. Ferocious ghouls roam the corridors, remnants of residents who never escaped. The Armory itself still exists, filled with weapons preserved despite decades of decay, a haunting symbol of the experiment's purpose. The tragedy of Vault 34 lies in its simplicity. There was no elaborate manipulation, no hidden psychological trick. Vault Tech merely provided excessive firepower and observed what happened. The outcome suggests that easy access to weapons in a confined, stressed community can destabilize social trust. Yet the story is more nuanced than simple cause and effect. The residents were not inherently violent. They faced the same pressures as any vault population: isolation, uncertainty, and limited resources. The weapons amplified existing tensions rather than creating them outright. Vault 34 also illustrates how technological abundance can become liability. Tools meant for protection turned into instruments of destruction when governance faltered. The connection between Vault 34 and the Boomers adds an interesting layer. The Boomers, descendants of Vault residents, maintain an obsession with artillery and heavy weaponry while living in self-imposed isolation. Their culture reflects lessons learned: trust outsiders less, rely on firepower for survival. In this way, the Vault's legacy extended beyond its destruction. Exploring Vault 34 reveals personal logs and environmental storytelling hinting at panic during the final days. Attempts to repair systems failed as radiation spread. Families likely faced impossible choices about escape or staying behind. The atmosphere inside the vault feels oppressive. Waterlogged corridors distort sound. Radiation counters click steadily. The sense of confinement lingers even centuries later. The vault's design itself became a trap. Narrow hallways amplified the danger of firefights. Damaged systems spread contamination faster than repairs could contain it. Compared to other experiments, Vault 34 feels almost realistic. It does not rely on extreme science or bizarre social constructs. It asks a grounded question about power, trust, and responsibility. What happens when everyone has the ability to escalate conflict instantly? The answer, in Vault 34's case, was catastrophe. As we move through the flooded ruins, imagining the moment when alarms first sounded and radiation warnings flashed red, the story becomes less about weapons themselves and more about human behavior under pressure. Tools are neutral. Systems are not. The residents may have believed their armory ensured safety. Instead, it magnified fear. The vault's final state, a glowing tomb filled with abandoned firepower, serves as a grim reminder that protection without balance can become self-destructive. In the broader Fallout narrative, Vault 34 reinforces the theme that experiments often reveal uncomfortable truths about society. Survival is not only about resources or technology, it depends on trust and restraint. Without those, even abundance becomes dangerous. And so, Vault 34 remains beneath the Mojave as a warning etched in rusted steel and radioactive water, a place where weapons outnumbered wisdom, where security became conflict, and where a community that sought safety behind fortified walls ultimately destroyed itself from within, leaving behind only echoes of gunfire and the steady glow of radiation to tell the story of an experiment that proved how easily power can turn inward when fear takes hold. One of the most disturbing vaults ever created, Vault 75, hidden beneath Malden Middle School in the Commonwealth. On the surface, the location seemed almost comforting. Families seeking shelter were directed into what appeared to be a school-based vault, a place that implied safety for children and education for the future. But Vault 75's true purpose was far darker. The experiment centered on eugenics and human optimization. Vault-Tec designed the vault to create genetically superior soldiers through controlled breeding, extreme training, and ruthless selection. Unlike other experiments that manipulated social dynamics indirectly, Vault 75 directly targeted children as test subjects. When the bombs fell, families rushed into the school, believing they were being saved. Upon entry, parents and adults were separated from their children under the pretense of medical screening and safety procedures. They were never reunited. Adults were systematically executed soon after arrival. The children, many too young to understand what had happened, were told that their parents had sacrificed themselves for the survival of humanity. This narrative was carefully crafted to ensure obedience and emotional dependency on the vault's authority. From that moment onward, life in Vault 75 became a cycle of training and testing. Education focused not on culture or creativity, but on combat readiness, physical fitness, and intellectual performance. Every child was evaluated constantly. Those who excelled advanced to higher levels of training. Those who fell behind were quietly removed from the program. The Vault's administrators believed they were creating the perfect human through selective pressure. Genetics, performance metrics, and psychological conditioning were combined to produce individuals optimized for strength and intelligence. The process was clinical, methodical, and deeply dehumanizing. Children lived in regimented environments where competition was encouraged. Friendships existed, but loyalty to the system was prioritized. Survival depended on performance. Emotional vulnerability was treated as weakness. As the first generation grew older, the program revealed its full cruelty. High-performing individuals were harvested for genetic material, their DNA preserved to influence future generations. Those who no longer met standards were retired, a euphemism for execution or termination. No one was meant to grow old in Vault 75. The cycle repeated endlessly. New children raised, tested, and filtered through increasingly strict criteria. Unlike Vault 34's accidental collapse or Vault 12's radiation exposure, Vault 75 operated exactly as intended for decades. This precision makes it especially horrifying. The children were not experiments incidentally affected by circumstances. They were the experiment itself. Logs discovered within the vault revealed detached discussions about performance scores and genetic viability. Researchers debated traits as though managing livestock rather than human lives. Emotional bonds were ignored in favor of data. Yet despite the system's cold design, humanity persisted in small ways. Some records suggest children formed secret friendships or questioned the narratives they were given. Curiosity and empathy, traits difficult to eliminate entirely, occasionally surfaced. These moments of resistance highlight the limits of conditioning. Eventually, Vault 75's program began to deteriorate. Whether due to resource shortages, internal conflict, or simple exhaustion of the system, operations collapsed. Administrators disappeared or died, leaving the vault abandoned. Centuries later, the vault was discovered and occupied by gunners, a mercenary faction drawn to its strategic location and remaining technology. Exploring Vault 75 inches, Fallout 4 reveals a chilling environment frozen in time, classrooms repurposed into training facilities, laboratories filled with medical equipment, child-sized living quarters standing eerily empty. The juxtaposition of school imagery with brutal experimentation is unsettling. Chalkboards and lockers coexist with execution chambers and genetic labs. The vault's design intentionally exploited the symbolism of education. Schools represent growth, safety, and future generations. Vault 75 twisted that symbolism into a system focused on efficiency and control. The experiment raises profound ethical questions about improvement versus humanity. Vault-Tec sought to engineer better people, but in doing so, remove the very experiences that define personhood, family, freedom, and choice. The children of Vault 75 never knew the world outside or the truth about their parents. Their identities were shaped entirely by performance metrics. This loss of personal history is one of the Vault's most tragic elements. Unlike Vault 17's residents, who were transformed physically, Vault 75's victims were shaped psychologically from the beginning. Their humanity was narrowed rather than erased. The Vault's obsession with genetics also reflects broader themes within Fallout, where attempts to perfect humanity often lead to suffering. The Enclave pursued purity through extermination. The Institute sought advancement through synthetic replication. Vault 75 pursued optimization through childhood conditioning. Each path rejected the unpredictability of human nature, and each ultimately failed. The collapse of Vault 75 suggests that systems built on exploitation cannot sustain themselves indefinitely. Without empathy or adaptability, even the most efficient programs decay. The presence of the gunners in the vault adds another layer of irony. A facility designed to produce elite warriors eventually became shelter for mercenaries driven by profit rather than ideology. The legacy of militarization continued, albeit in a different form. As we move through the silent halls of Vault 75, the atmosphere feels heavy with absence. Toys and training equipment sit side by side. Dormitories lie untouched. The echoes of drills and lessons seem almost audible. The vault stands as a reminder that some of Vault-Tech's experiments were not about observing behavior under stress, but about actively reshaping humanity into something new. And in this case, the cost was childhood itself. Vault 75's story lingers because it feels uniquely personal. The victims were children who never had the chance to make choices about their lives. Their futures were planned before they entered the vault. In the broader context of Fallout's history, Vault 75 represents the extreme endpoint of controlled experimentation, a place where efficiency replaced compassion entirely. As we leave the vault behind and return to the quiet ruins above, the image of a school hiding such darkness remains difficult to forget. And so Vault 75 closes our journey through these experiments with a sobering reminder. Even in a world already destroyed by war, humanity's greatest cruelties sometimes emerge not from chaos, but from carefully planned systems that believe they are building a better future, one controlled decision at a time, until the people inside are no longer seen as individuals, but as data points in an endless experiment that forgot why humanity needed saving in the first place. Ending our journey with one of the most unsettling vault experiments ever created, Vault 106, hidden within the forests of the capital wasteland. Unlike vaults, where the danger came from violence, political manipulation, or biological disaster, Vault 106 targeted something far more fragile: the mind itself. At first glance, Vault 106 appeared ordinary. Families entered expecting safety from nuclear devastation. The corridors were clean, the systems functional, and life initially followed the familiar rhythm seen in many other vaults: orientation briefings, assignment of quarters, and the cautious optimism that comes from surviving the end of the world. But Vault 106 carried a hidden directive embedded into its design. 10 days after the vault sealed, a colorless psychoactive gas would be released into the air supply. The residents were never told. For the first week and a half, life likely felt stable. People settled into routines. Children adapted to underground life. Leadership structures formed, and residents began imagining their future within the safety of reinforced walls. Then the gas entered the ventilation system. At first, symptoms were subtle: mild dizziness, difficulty concentrating, occasional confusion. The effects might have seemed like stress or adjustment to confinement, but the gas was engineered for long-term psychological disruption. Hallucinations began. Residents reported seeing figures that weren't there. Shadows moved unexpectedly. Voices echoed through corridors without clear sources. Sleep became difficult as nightmares intensified. Anxiety spread through the population, yet no one understood the cause. As exposure continued, paranoia took root. People questioned their own perceptions. Friends accused each other of sabotage or deception. Leadership struggled to maintain order as reality itself began to feel unstable. Unlike Vault 19, where distrust was manufactured socially, Vault 106 chemically altered perception. Residents did not merely suspect others, they doubted their own senses. This distinction makes Vault 106 especially disturbing. The experiment removed the one tool people rely on most during crisis: certainty of reality. As the gas accumulated, the effects worsened. Hallucinations became vivid and intrusive. Some residents reportedly saw grotesque visions of family members or enemies. Others experienced violent mood swings. Without understanding the source, attempts to restore order failed. The vault descended into chaos. Accounts suggest that many residents turned violent, reacting to perceived threats that existed only in their minds. Some isolated themselves in locked rooms. Others roamed the corridors in fear or aggression. The breakdown was rapid. Within weeks, Vault 106's society collapsed completely. Unlike Vault 11's gradual moral erosion or Vault 15's ideological divisions, Vault 106 was dismantled by altered perception. The experiment demonstrated how quickly social structures crumble when reality becomes unreliable. Over time, survivors either died, succumbed to madness, or transformed into feral ghouls as the vault systems deteriorated. The gas continued lingering in the environment, ensuring that anyone entering later would also experience hallucinations. Centuries later, explorers entering Vault 106 encounter one of the most psychologically unsettling environments in Fallout 3. The vault appears abandoned, yet strange visions appear suddenly. Flashes of people running, shadows crossing hallways, echoes of voices that vanish instantly. These hallucinations are not merely atmospheric design. They represent remnants of the experiment still affecting intruders. The player experiences confusion similar to what the original residents endured. This immersive effect makes Vault 106 unique. It does not simply tell a story through logs or skeletons. It recreates the experience of losing grip on reality. Terminal entries found within the vault reveal escalating panic among staff. Some attempted to identify the source of the symptoms, but were themselves affected. Medical teams became unreliable as doctors began hallucinating alongside patients. The experiment's cruelty lies in its simplicity. Vault-Tec wanted to observe long-term exposure to psychoactive substances in a closed population. The residents were not informed or prepared. They became unwitting subjects in a study of psychological resilience and its limits. Vault 106 raises questions about identity and perception. If your senses betray you, how do you distinguish truth from illusion? How does a community function when every individual experiences reality differently? The answer, in this vault, was that it could not. The collapse left behind a haunting silence. Unlike Vault 22's living greenery or Vault 34's flooded corridors, Vault 106 feels stagnant, as though the air itself carries memory. The lingering hallucinations suggest that the gas never fully dissipated. Even centuries later, the experiment continues passively, affecting anyone who enters. This persistence makes the vault feel almost alive. Thematically, Vault 106 reflects a recurring Fallout idea. The greatest dangers are often internal rather than external. The residents were protected from radiation and raiders, yet destroyed by their own altered minds. Fear became self-sustaining. The vault's design also highlights Vault-Tec's willingness to exploit psychological suffering for data. Physical survival was secondary to observation. Whether residents recovered or not mattered less than the results. Compared to Vault 75's systematic training or Vault 12's radiation exposure, Vault 106 feels deeply personal. Mental stability is intangible, difficult to protect, and easily manipulated. Exploring the vault today means stepping into unresolved trauma. Hallways flicker with ghostly figures. Rooms shift between calm and chaos depending on perception. The experience mirrors the confusion that residents likely endured in their final days, unsure whether danger was real or imagined. And perhaps that uncertainty was the point. As we drift through Vault 106's dim corridors, imagining families trying to comfort one another while reality unraveled around them, the tragedy feels intimate. No grand ideology drove the experiment. No external enemy invaded. The enemy was perception itself. The Vault's story reminds us that human communities rely not just on resources or leadership, but on shared reality. When that foundation cracks, everything else follows. In the broader timeline of Fallout Vault experiments, Vault 106 stands as a chilling example of psychological manipulation at its most extreme, a place where the walls remained intact, the systems functioned, but the minds inside slowly fractured until nothing recognizable remained. And so, we leave Vault 106 as the final chapter of this journey, a quiet, haunted space where the air still whispers with hallucinations, where reality bends just enough to unsettle anyone who enters, and where the experiment proved that sometimes the most terrifying dangers are not monsters or radiation, but the slow realization that you can no longer trust your own thoughts, and the world around you may never have been as stable as it seemed.